Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger, China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable information. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Committee on the Present Danger China's webinars on the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party and its friends to the United States and the free world more generally. We are delighted to be able to take advantage of this weekly visit to update on a topic that we've been addressing with frequency, and that is the so-called no limits partnership between our two principal adversaries at the moment, the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia. We have had important developments within the past week or so in both countries' programs, agendas, and dangers. With respect to Communist China, in the course of the rather appalling performance of Secretary of State Antony Blinken during his visit to Beijing, we got wind of a new and quite ominous development. It's been present in various forms for some time, namely the Chinese Communist Party's presence in Cuba. But in addition to apparently considerably expanding and increasing the capabilities of its electronic signal intelligence collection facility in Cuba, there is the prospect that that facility is going to now be given additional capabilities, perhaps for sophisticated cyber warfare as well. If that were not bad enough, we're told there's going to be a so-called military training facility in the mix, which has the prospect, as we'll be talking about at length with our featured panelists, of being a power projection capability of the kinetic kind for China from an island 90 miles off our shore. For Russia's part, of course, there has been some high drama in connection with the march on Moscow that was briefly mounted by the Wagner Group, a mercenary outfit that has been used by the Kremlin under Vladimir Putin for various black bag jobs and other messy businesses of warfare in Syria, in Africa, and most recently in Ukraine. To make sense of these developments, to respond to them from the perspective of the Committee on the Present Danger China and our colleagues, we're very pleased to be able to present a program that will, well, take stock of what these two developments and associated events portend in terms of this no limits partnership and the threat it poses to us and freedom more generally. To kick things off, we wanted to give you a sense of, well, how Tony Blinken doubtless conducted himself in Beijing in the process of kowtowing before the Chinese Communist Party, but how he's also been responding to questions about this Cuban dimension of the unrestricted warfare now being waged against us by the Chinese Communist Party. It's a clip from his appearance last Sunday on Meet the Press, NBC's program with Chuck Todd. And we'll give you just 50 seconds or so introduction to our first speaker. And we'll go to that videotape now.
Are we going to prevent China from having a military base on the island of Cuba?
We have been not only looking, but also engaging in a number of countries over the last couple of years where China is trying to get a foothold. And we've been engaged diplomatically in a number of places.
Yeah.
And we've had some success in either preventing that, delaying that, or turning that around. We continue to do that. I've raised that directly with my Chinese counterparts. They know where we stand on that issue.
Are we going to make sure it doesn't happen? Is this a line in the sand?
Again, we've made clear that this is a real concern. And as I said, in a variety of places where China has tried to get a foothold militarily or with intelligence, we've been not only looking at that, we've been taking action to try to push back, and we've had some success.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel a lot better about this threat from Cuba in the form of the Chinese Communist Party's building capabilities, and to discuss much more realistic way what's at stake and what we must be now contemplating. I'm very pleased to say, is a frequent contributor to these programs. He is a senior associate of our Center for Security Policy, where he directs our China program. His name is Dr. Bradley Thayer. He has a very impressive pedigree of his own studies in academia and teaching others in first-rate universities around the world. He is an author, most recently a co-author with Lin Chao Han of Understanding the China Threat, a columnist for American Greatness with another of our very important contributors and colleagues, Captain James Fennell, at AmericanGreatness.com, and published in myriad other outlets on a prodigiously prolific basis. We've asked Dr. Thayer to address, as I say, this question of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to in Cuba. It's a new front in its unrestricted warfare against America and the weaponizing of Cuba that it represents. Dr. Thayer, it's great to have you with us. Sir, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Frank. It's my pleasure to join you today, and I'm honored to participate in the program on such an important topic and with such an illustrious group of my colleagues. The revelation that China has a series of bases now in Cuba is a direct threat to U.S. national security, and it is for 5 major reasons. The first of which is what's true in real estate is also true in intelligence collection, and that is location matters. So the bases that China possesses in Cuba offers China the ability to collect intelligence some 90 miles from U.S. shores. And that gives China a permanent intelligence collection vector over much of the eastern United States that China had lacked. And although China collects intelligence in many different ways, a spy balloon, of course, as our audience will recall, through satellites, through human intelligence sources and other mechanisms, this is a permanent, one of the bases will be a permanent signals intelligence collection base for China. And that includes the eastern United States, will include very close to Cuba, important bases, such as the U.S. Navy's base at Kings Bay, Georgia, where ballistic missile carrying submarines on the East Coast, a sortie for their missions. It's critical, we have critical U.S. Air Force bases, Eglin Air Force Base and Tyndall Air Force Base, where the Air Force trains and conducts tests of weaponry. The United States Navy's Pensacola facility, of course, in the eponymous Pensacola, Florida, where they train naval aviators. And then, equally importantly, commands are located. Southern Command, United States Southern Command, is located in Miami. And then in Tampa at MacDill Air Force Base, we have Special Operations Command and Central Command, important bases there. So the Chinese bases increase the burden of the U.S. intelligence community. It's not only an intelligence vector, but it increases the burden of the U.S. intelligence community and the military, in that it requires both our intelligence community and the military to adopt measures to negate the ability of the bases to collect against them. Second, the intelligence collection base provides China with the ability to project power also against U.S. military and civilian targets in the United States. That includes infrastructure such as the electrical grid of the United States or cyber networks of the U.S. It also provides China with the ability to monitor and possibly interdict the U.S. Sea Line of Communication, or SLOC, S-L-O-C, from the Gulf of Mexico into the Atlantic. And it would be an important vector for Chinese attack in the event of crisis or war against the United States. Those bases would be, as we worried about the Soviets' use of those bases in the course of the Cold War. So the bases fundamentally increase the threat posed to the U.S. homeland and to other interests, the U.S. military and other allies in Central, South America, and in the Caribbean. Third, even apart from the U.S., the base is an important facility to support covert action that China may execute in the region, or wars that China may fight outside of the region, or to support China's interests in military campaigns worldwide. As China sadly increasingly has a global presence and an active global presence, we should expect their need to support their campaigns and their covert action campaigns and others in the future. Just as it was in the Cold War, when Cuba was an important base, again, for the Soviet Union, the Soviets also employed Cuban soldiers as proxies in Angola, Ethiopia, in Grenada, Nicaragua, and other countries as well, Yemen. So the world might again witness deployments of Cuban troops in the service of China, just as the Cuban military served the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Fourth, the base is an important blow against the U.S. in the realm of political warfare, and it is so by overtly planting China's flag in Cuba. It's a poke in the eye of the Monroe Doctrine. It's also a violation of Article 6 of the 1947 Rio Treaty, as China's presence in Cuba is a threat to peace in the hemisphere. It's China's effort to show, as part of their political warfare campaign, an ongoing political warfare campaign, that the United States is a weak and a declining power. As the U.S. is unable to prevent a series of bases on its doorstep, it provides China with the not only the military capabilities and the intelligence capabilities, the ability to deploy missiles and aircraft, perhaps in the future, and the ability in political warfare to try to establish some type of equivalency or political equivalency with Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific, of course, a key interest of the United States in the Western Pacific, which is about 110 miles from China at its closest point. Fifth, also in the realm of political warfare, the base forces the U.S. to recall its unhappy history with communist Cuba in the Cold War, where obviously the audience will recall or have heard of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in October 1962, where the Kennedy administration agreed to withdraw Jupiter medium-range missiles from Turkey and from Italy, with 6 months after the Soviets agreed to take out their medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles from Cuba and Ilyushin 28 bombers from Cuba at that time. So Cuba has been a source of diplomatic defeats and setbacks, as in 1962, and then the Carter administration revealed in 1979 the existence of a Soviet combat brigade in Cuba, which Carter was unable to force the Soviets to withdraw. So Cuba's history is significant because it reminds Americans of, again, their unhappy history with Cuba. And that's not lost on the Chinese Communist Party, again, as they seek to demonstrate that they're on the rise, they're the rising power, and the United States is in a period of decline. So those political warfare messages are important because China is speaking not only to Western audiences, the United States and in Western Europe, but also globally to audiences around the world. For example, in the BRICS, where China's message might be more favorably received than it would be, for example, in Western Europe. So these bases in Cuba, in conclusion, are significant because of the real capabilities they provide, the Chinese intelligence capabilities, their forces to collect against U.S. military, civilian targets. It allows China with the ability to project power from Cuba. That would be military power that the Chinese might use in the event, again, of a crisis or war with the United States. And that hurts us greatly and is a cause of great concern to us because the Chinese can generate power to project in Central America, in Panama against the Panama Canal. They have influence there already, but this only augments that, and also in the Caribbean and in South America. So the concern is a very real one, and the political warfare problems that I identified are also significant for the United States and compel the United States to take measures to eject China from these bases in Cuba. Now, given U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's remarks, which Frank Gaffney very helpfully played at the outset or before my talks, we have little hope that the Biden administration is going to put the coercive pressure necessary to eject these Chinese bases from Cuban soil. So bases are a national security threat to the United States, and the United States should apply its prodigious abilities to force Cuba to no longer to dehost them and to compel China to withdraw them.
Right, thank you. And as always, you've added a lot of texture to this conversation with your 5 points. We will come back in a moment to what some of the actions that we could usefully take are and the importance of doing so. And we're going to pivot now to the other main topic of today's conversation, and that is what on earth has been going on in Russia of late, and what are the implications for both the Russian people, obviously, the Ukrainian people as well, and for the rest of us more broadly, especially with the strategic partnership with China being what it is, and the enabling of Putin that we've seen from Xi Jinping in the past year in particular. To brief us on the lay of the land in Russia, I can't think of anybody better than a man who worked for some 6 years with Vladimir Putin at the highest levels of the Kremlin as his chief economic advisor. He was never particularly aligned with Putin, served his country, however, for a while, and then finally broke with Putin and has left the Russian Federation, including now working very closely with us at the Center for Security Policy as our senior analyst for Russian and European affairs. His name is Andrei Illarionov, and he is both deeply knowledgeable about the topic at hand, as well as able to articulate with considerable authority what it is that Putin is going to do next. And what we've asked him to address specifically is the topic of the coup, assessing what happened and forthcoming in Russia and beyond. Let's go to a videotape, which is the way we were able to arrange for Andrei to join us on this occasion.
The so-called mutiny of Mr. Prigozhin with his private company Wagner has revealed several very important features of the current political regime in Russia and the reactions on this mutiny and on the political regime in Russia from outside. What are the most important observations we can make right now? First, it was not a coup aimed at overthrowing Putin or Putin's regime. Mr. Prigozhin never set such a goal, never proclaimed that his goal is to overthrow Putin or regime or to change regime or to replace anyone except of two persons, Minister of Defense Shoigu and the Chief of Staff Gerasimov. So that is why this is a very private affair between some fractions of the Putin's regime, not anything that is aimed on changing this regime or replacing this regime or overthrowing this regime. Second, it has been demonstrated very vividly that this private company Wagner is not private. It is state-run, state-funded. And today, Mr. Putin has explained in details and described how much money has been spent on this company. So that's exactly what people discussed for at length for all these many years, that the so-called private company is not private company. This is state company. And today, not anyone but Putin himself has confirmed it. And he mentioned numbers with billions of US dollars that the Putin's government has spent on this company. Third, a very important observation that this state company that has accumulated probably the best trained forces within Russian troops has demonstrated a remarkable ability to achieve its goal. Within 24 hours, they moved at distance approximately 800 kilometers from Lugansk and Rostov to Moscow. And by the speed and easiness with which it was moving, it is by far the best, the most impressive special military operations in which Russian forces have been involved over the last 3 decades. Next point is the fear that has engulfed Putin personally and his entourage during these 24 hours mutiny. Putin has been frightened very deeply, and he tried to stop these columns unsuccessfully. And he used, as we know, air forces that have been shot down by Wagner. And in the process of this mutiny, Putin asked for help. And this is remarkable whom he asked for this help. He asked for the help, in this case, leaders of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkey. Looks like that Kazakh and Uzbek leaders politely declined their participation in this crisis. Mr. Lukashenko participated in this crisis, but it was what is really remarkable and no precedent in history of Russia for all this multi-century history of this state, that Mr. Erdogan, president of Turkey, has suggested his mediation services in solving Russian domestic crisis. Now, the so-called Putin has not been put down in the very strict sense of this word, because nobody has been arrested, nobody has been shot among those who launched this uprising. Moreover, it has been reached some kind of deal, according to which Prigozhin himself, with part of his troops, would move to Belarus. And definitely it does not look like it's going to be the prison or something like that. It looks like that this company and these forces would continue their service for Belarus and for Russian forces and for Putin himself, probably new capacity. How it will develop, it is too early to say, but it appears that the security environment of Putin and military environment of Putin tacitly behind, not necessarily Prigozhin personally, but behind the idea not to destroy this company. initially, Putin wanted to destroy this company and destroy its leadership, but looks like that the balance of power has changed so dramatically that Putin was not able to do it. And as a result, the deal has been achieved. And it shows to the, first of all, to regime itself, to Russian people and to outsiders around the world, that the so-called personalistic regime of Putin is not personalistic regime. This is much more like a military or security junta, within which the balance of power is distributed unevenly, and the positions of different forces in this junta is not yet clear as of the current situation. What also necessary to mention, what position has been taken by some Western participants in this geopolitical battle, especially by G7 country and by the Biden administration. They have contacted Kremlin, and as the White House has announced, they had very good communications with Kremlin. And as it has been revealed later by CNN and by the Financial Times, Biden's administration sidelined with Putin against Prigozhin. So that is why they publicly put a pressure on Ukrainians not to attack offensive assets on the Russian territory during the crisis, and not to attack Russia at all, just not to allow political instability in Russia, which is in the language of the White House, meaning Putin's political regime, which means that Biden's administration fully supported Putin's regime in the war between Putin's forces and Ukraine. This is one of the most outstanding, shocking, and even scandalous facts that the Biden regime is demonstrating itself as ally of Putin against Ukraine. So the very fact shows that in the critical situations, which one was just happened over the last few days in front of our eyes, in all those critical situations, Biden administration is supporting Putin and is saving Putin's regime. So that is why the main question that has been discussed over the last year and a half, whether Ukraine is able to defeat Putin's regime, the answer is very clearly, as long as Biden's administration is supporting Putin's regime, not only China or Iran or North Korea, but as long as the Biden administration is supporting Putin's regime, it would be very hard for Ukraine alone to defeat aggressor.
I'm delighted to welcome next J.R. Nyquist, a man who is also a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, a brilliant strategic analyst, the author of The Origins of the Fourth World War, and most recently, The Fool and His Enemy. We are talking about the larger sort of strategic status of this partnership between the Russians and the Chinese and where it's going to go from here. And Jeff, I just wanted to add to what Brad Thayer described in terms of the possible threats from Cuba for the purposes of further illuminating your comments. You have spent much of your professional life worrying about things like biological warfare and electromagnetic pulse attack, hypersonic missiles and containerized hypersonic missiles, among other things, all of which now could be also in the mix in terms of this additional threat from the Chinese based on Cuban soil. We're delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours, sir.
Southern Command General Laura Richardson has warned that Russia and China are both moving into Latin America, supporting allies there. And this Russia-China coordination or cooperation is not really something new. It is something that has a long history. If we go back to the defector testimony, there was a Russian GRU officer who worked in China who spoke fluent Mandarin. His name was Colonel Stanislav Lunev. And he alleged upon his defection in 92 that at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had collapsed, that Russia and China were making secret agreements to coordinate their intelligence services against the United States. The Cold War didn't end, as was Luna's testimony. And he even spoke about him going to his boss at the GRU in Washington. He was then working against the United States. And he said, well, now that the Soviet Union is over, what are our instructions? Do we continue spying against the United States? And of course, the US was sending food to the Russian people in that difficult time. And their message came back from Moscow saying, increase your efforts of spying against the United States. And so the shift to Boris Yeltsin was not a real shift. Behind the scenes, they were accelerating their campaign of espionage, working with the Chinese. Another data point, Chris Cox, who led the Cox Committee investigation into Chinagate during the Clinton administration, was asked to testify before the Senate afterwards. And under questioning by the Senate, he revealed one of the most surprising things his investigation had discovered was the amount of help that Russia was giving to communist China in a ballistic missile and nuclear technology to develop their weapons. And then we have a number of developments in the last 30 years. The Shanghai Treaty Organization, in which Russia and China are the basic strong partners in that. We have the BRICS alliance, which Russia and China, of course, lead. Which is an economic kind of alliance. And of course, we have these events in Latin America that General Richardson has pointed to. We've got, Lula da Silva, who really founded the Sao Paulo Forum with Fidel Castro to use the left in South America and Latin America as a platform for the takeover by Marxists of many of the countries there. And they've been very successful. Lula is back as president of Brazil. You have a communist regime in Venezuela. You have Daniel Ortega in power in Nicaragua. You have leftist or Marxist presidents elected in various South American countries. And Russia and China are there supporting those countries, supporting those leaders. Now placing in context this bizarre event that happened in 2020, the pandemic, this unprecedented event, you had numerous sources in China were coming up, and it was in the Chinese military press, prepare for war. And we were hearing that China wanted to get ready for war with America here as we're being hit by this pandemic. I was receiving reports also by sources in Southeast Asia and in Russia that China was pushing for war. And that what my sources said was Russia was telling China we're not ready for war. So why wasn't Russia ready? Why was this partnership? Russia is sort of a hobbled partner of China in this adventure. Russia in 2014, there was the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. And one of the major factors of weakening Russia is that the aerospace industry of the Soviet Union had been in large part involved with Ukrainian companies, Ukrainian missile plants, and so on. These in 2014, Russia and Ukraine got into a war in Donbass, basically. Russia annexed Crimea. And so these relationships where Ukraine had inputs into the Russian military economy were at an end. And this was very damaging to Russia's strategic wherewithal. We don't know how damaging it is, but there's indications that they regarded the loss of Ukraine, the flight of Yanukovych out of the presidency of Ukraine as tremendously damaging to them. So what we have is Putin then in early February of 2022, last year, going to Beijing and announcing this partnership. And they said in their joint statement at the time that China and Russia's partnership was the most important, powerful strategic partnership since World War II. And then Putin goes back to Russia and then invades Ukraine. And that is, I think was a necessary step for Russia to try to regain its strategic footing. Of course, we all know that the Russian invasion of Ukraine miscarried, and they got bogged down in what is a disastrous war. But nonetheless, last year, when many analysts believe Russia was going to win the war in the summer, China gave a mobilization order, according to sources in China. And there was this 57-minute tape of a military-civil meeting in Guangdong about mobilization. But no real mobilization ended up happening. They wanted to get ready by November 1st for war, but they didn't. Why? Russia, again, was not able to win in Ukraine. You had September, the Ukrainian counteroffensive that so hurt the Russians. The Russians lost the Battle of Kiev. They lost the Battle of Kherson. So one might ask, with this war in Europe, why China didn't take advantage of the situation. If America's focused in Europe, why doesn't China blockade Taiwan or invade Taiwan? Well, in the defector literature, I found one of the defectors who had predicted this Sino-Soviet alliance, Anatoly Golitsyn, in his book New Lies for Old, and his book The Perestroika Deception, described the strategic relationship as one of them having to change off what they do, so that both of them are not put at risk at one time in case something goes wrong. It's sort of like the process of cataract surgery. When you have cataracts, they do one eye, and then they make sure that eye is good, and then they go on to the next eye in case there's some problem. It seems to me that the Ukraine invasion was sort of like cataract surgery in one eye, and now that one eye is blind. They cannot risk doing something in Taiwan and having the other eye being blind. So they want to fix the bad eye before they go on to try something else, because they can't have two failures. They don't want to have two of them. So that is the explanation that at least one analyst gave. So I think the danger involves Russia's involvement in Ukraine, that they need Russia to be whole again, and it's proved to be disastrous. How they will get out of it, there's now currently a dust up about nuclear war. This thing in Russia with the mutiny. The strange thing, the disturbing thing, is Yuri Felzhinsky, the Russian historian, predicted that nukes would go into Belarusia before they went in. He predicted that a rogue group would seize those weapons in July and use them against Lithuania and Poland. Everyone discounted this. Unfortunately, weirdly, we have a mutiny in Russia by a rogue group of soldiers. Now we find the leader of this mutiny, Mr. Prigozhin, is going to Belarusia with 5,000 of his rogue troops. So now you got a rogue group in Belarusia with the nuclear weapons. And now, even more bizarrely, the NATO summit is being held on July 11th. There's concerns in Vilnius, Lithuania. There's concerns about it. And now there's strangely, Russia has sent a government plane to go fetch the diplomats from Washington. How many, I don't know, but it's in the news this morning. And then there's this weird story from the pro-Russian media that Victoria Nuland, it's probably a false story, but it shows intent on the Russian propaganda and disinformation. Victoria Nuland has supposedly told the Ukrainians that World War III is going to begin on July 11th. So these stories are being planted, and so they're trying to get out of it. But China and Russia are working together in all this. So watch what China does now.
Jeff Nyquist, thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there, particularly your last points about the Third World War starting, whether it's on July 11th or any other time, and how this Prigozhin redeployment might bear in on that with respect to attack nukes now in Belarus, or perhaps opening a renewed front against Kyiv from the Belarusian territory. The starting point, I think, is that this array of potential threats that we might face, and they may be already there, frankly, folks. These containerized missiles are of particular concern. The Chinese move containers around the world every day by the millions, I think, and certainly into and out of Cuba, inserting such weapon systems that look from the outside to be just another container is child's play. And that raises a set of questions that are very different, of course, from the first Cuban Missile Crisis, but may be what's involved in a second one. We believe that the Chinese Communist Party, and when I say we, I don't want to suggest that every member of the Committee on the Present Danger China has endorsed these ideas, but we think that they're the kinds of ideas that ought to be discussed and adopted as appropriate, as urgently as we can, including the idea of giving the Chinese Communist Party 72 hours to begin removing threatening personnel and capabilities from the island or face retaliation by the adoption of unrestricted warfare techniques of our own, many of which we've argued in our book, The Indictment, prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world, should be taken in any event. They're long overdue. I'll talk about a couple of them in a moment. But a failure on the part of President Biden to act to protect us against what's developing now in Cuba should be added to the list of items in the long and growing bill of particulars of high crimes and misdemeanors that would justify his impeachment. But to this point about what our kinds of unrestricted warfare techniques might be at the moment and are in order, one would be clearly to put our country on a war footing comparable to what I believe China has adopted. And we may have a discussion in the Q&A about the point that Jeff has just made, that China's mobilization has not materialized. It certainly seems to me as though much of it is in place and more is a building. We'll talk about that more momentarily. But in the meantime, in addition to simply mobilizing the American people behind the idea that what's happening in Cuba at the heads of the CCP is unacceptable, we think these sorts of steps are in order to terminate the Chinese preferential access to our capital markets. This is a product of a deal that Joe Biden presided over in May of 2013, giving us real sweetheart arrangements that have enabled trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to have been migrated from the investments of Americans in benign things, patriotic things perhaps as well, to our mortal enemy. This now includes funds of military personnel and government employees through the thrift savings plans, migration of some of their funds. We believe that the Chinese must honor their obligations to American investors in the form of sovereign bonds before they're allowed to sell any more of them to our country. This is potentially worth $1 trillion or more to Americans. We believe that the Chinese Communist Party ought to be identified for what it is, a transnational criminal organization. And this helps in a number of different ways, particularly in dealing with their friends in this country who are aiding and abetting them, essentially serving as accomplices in their criminal conduct. We're calling for the, as I mentioned in the book, The Indictment, the prosecution at a minimum in the court of public opinion of both the Chinese and their enablers. One of the most important recommendations, and it's frankly something that we've got to be coming to grips with anyway, is if the Chinese do not withdraw these personnel from Cuba that are threatening to us, and essentially closing down this military training facility and that increasingly dangerous intelligence operation as well. Chinese nationals who are here by the hundreds of thousands, many of them students, should be repatriated. This is something that might give them 30 days to get their affairs in order, but this is something that has to be managed. Especially, we need to find and remove the thousands, and I've heard estimates as high as 10,000 Chinese military-aged unaccompanied men who seem to be carrying more or less identical kit and traveling in groups, who've entered our country across our southern border illegally and have been dispersed all over the country with taxpayer resources, as have other illegal immigrants. I could go on, but I think just to sort of tie this together, we need to be demonstrating our support, not for the regime, of communist Cuba, or for that matter, the regime of communist China, but for their people. And our solidarity with them should start with delegitimizing those odious regimes and doing everything we can to undermine them. This is war. They are engaged in it against us, and our steps need to be properly responsive in the face of their unrestricted warfare by adopting such techniques of our own. Let's open this up to our panelists for some questions. Brad Thayer, maybe I can start with you. You talked, I think, powerfully, as you often do, about the political warfare dimension of China's unrestricted warfare against us. Now, this new Cuban front being a fresh manifestation of it. As a valued member of our committee on the present danger of China, I know that you believe that we must be bringing sort of countervailing efforts to bear. What kinds of political warfare strategies do you think are most needed at the moment, including perhaps some of those that I've mentioned?
That's a very important question and a key issue. We shouldn't be on the back foot here, as we often are in political warfare, sadly. The Biden administration is not as effective and seldom gets ahead of these issues. It often seems to be well behind. But key issues that we can illuminate in the realm of political warfare is there's birds of a feather here are flocking together. In Havana, you have a communist government, and in Beijing, you have a communist government. Both of those governments oppress their people and stand in the way of their liberty, of their freedom. In Cuba, of course, we have in Florida, of course, and elsewhere in the United States, but particularly in Florida, a very strong and active Cuban-American community that can be particularly active in assisting the Biden administration, if it were warranted, if it were and wanted, to actively undermine the Cuban government by calling attention to this issue, just as the Cuban people were slaves to Soviet power through Fidel Castro's government. Now, sadly, the Cuban people are becoming slaves of the communist government in China, the Chinese Communist Party. And so, in some respects, nothing has changed between the Cold War and the new Cold War that we find ourselves in with China. So that's a very powerful message. Equally powerful would be, of course, the identification, which we have tremendous empirical evidence. Wherever the Chinese Communist Party shows up, they exploit people ruthlessly. And equally, they exploit the environment ruthlessly. So China's presence in Cuba is going to be defined by the exploitation of the Cuban people and destruction of the environment there as well. Those are some of the arrows that we have in our quiver in the realm of political warfare. And it just requires the Biden administration to make the effort to delegitimize the step. Thirdly, the Monroe Doctrine. So in the American context, we have a Monroe Doctrine from 1823, as amended by Theodore Roosevelt, of course. And that states that we will not tolerate any a foreign intervention, of course, in the Western Hemisphere. So the Biden administration could speak to the American people using the Monroe Doctrine and also using the Rio Treaty to underscore how this violates those measures. So those are some of the steps, Frank, that could be done immediately to address this issue.
Thank you, Brad. I know you have spoken elsewhere about this idea of a tribunal to examine the crimes the Chinese Communist Party has engaged in, particularly against its own people, as some that they've enslaved and now call Chinese, but the Tibetans and Uyghurs and Southern Mongolians, the people of Hong Kong, aside, the vast majority of those that have been murdered, by some estimates, 100 million of them, to say nothing of those killed in the womb, by some estimates, for maybe even as many as 500 million, mostly girls. This would seem to me to be a very important moment to be encouraging the establishment of such a tribunal.
The Chinese Communist Party has committed aggression in international politics against their neighbors and, in fact, globally. They're committing chemical a warfare against the United States, the American people, as well as globally. Fentanyl just goes not to the United States, but is a global product and is made possible by the Chinese Communist Party. They're committing genocide against Muslims in Xinjiang and Hunan. We're witnessing a new form, a new chapter in that genocide. The party itself, as you observed, has killed an estimated 100 million people. Historically, they backed the Khmer Rouge, which committed genocide against their own people, the Khmer people in Cambodia, as well as the Vietnamese minority in Cambodia. So wherever this regime shows up, it's odious, its behavior is sordid. And so we should not allow the Cuban people. We should convey to the Cuban people that, of course, your government, the Cuban government, is tying itself to the most odious government, the one which is presently committing genocide. And that's not what the Cuban people, the great Cuban people with their tremendous history and with their great activity, who sadly are shackled. They're fettered by their government. They should have no ties whatsoever with the Chinese Communist Party, just as the Chinese people are shackled and fettered by the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a gang of thugs, of course, as you'd expect with communist governments. And I think drawing those parallels, illuminating them, again, is measures the Biden administration could take to help generate popular resistance worldwide to the actions that China is undertaking presently.
Thank you, Brad. Jeff, let me come back to this issue of mobilization, if we can. You study these things closely. You understand the importance of preparation for military conflict. And I think, as you noted, the Chinese government has been signaling that's what it expects its people to do. Not only in that warning order you mentioned, I think, but in the exhortations to rally around the flag and the threats of the foreign barbarian adversary, and meaning us, as well as the need for sacrifice and accepting increased repression. Even, do you feel as though the Chinese have actually abandoned that course of action in light of the difficulties that their Russian friends have had? Or is it possible that that's going on, but perhaps in a less overt and public way than had been initially the case?
It's not clear that they've abandoned it. Full mobilization is an extremely expensive process. So once you go to full mobilization, you're going to have to go to war. And so you can ramp up, you can get closer to where you're in a better position to fully mobilize quicker, but you don't want to hurt your economy that way. And of course, we don't know exactly what their military plans are. Blockade Taiwan, invade up to the second island chain. The Luda media people who smuggled that 57-minute tape out of China were talking about invading up to the second island chain. They were talking about some kind of Pearl Harbor style strike against the American fleet and bases in the Pacific, maybe even involving a nuclear war. It's unclear what was really contemplated. We also have these Chinese crossing the border. We've got by some reports, a seven-fold increase in Chinese nationals down in Mexico coming through the border. So what is this? Is this an indicator? We don't know. The nuclear threats out of Russia, is this part of it? We don't know. So we have to kind of watch it very carefully, because we're in, I think, an increased danger situation from both Russia and China.
And Brad, your thoughts on the state of mobilization in China at the moment?
One point we always must bear in mind is that China can aggress against Taiwan with little and no warning. And so we're anticipating indication and warning of an attack, and that's usually going to be the case. But we always want to keep in mind it could happen very quickly with assets that China has in Taiwan already, in conjunction with the junk fleet, essentially, with vessels in the Taiwan Straits and near Taiwan additionally. So I think that there's no question, as Jeff has observed, this is a cause of great concern. We want to keep in mind U.S. Air Force General Mike Minahan's remarks in late January. Those remarks were leaked, where he mentioned that he expected China to attack Taiwan by 2025. And indeed, as Jeff has suggested, and which I concur, it could happen much sooner than that. It could happen again almost any day. It can occur, and we should really be thoughtful and creative when we think through how, not the objective. The Chinese Communist Party is determined to conquer Taiwan, but their creativity in bringing that about to catch us by surprise. U.S. and key allies like Japan, Australia, and partners like India in the region. So General Minahan suggesting 2025. Usually the date of 2027 is touted. I think it will quite likely happen far sooner than that. For the reasons that Jeff has observed. And again, we should expect too some element of disinformation and confusion where the Chinese make some movements, of course, if they're doing. We're becoming routinized to violations of Taiwanese airspace and sea space. And as that pressure continues, that's another key indicator that events may happen very quickly and unexpectedly. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure you don't disagree with that. Following, studying, and monitoring Jeff Nyquist's practice of tyrants to use surprise as one of their techniques. We've had a number of really great questions from audience members, and one that I think it would behoove us to address directly is the question of fellow travelers by an audience member. Whether it's Joe Biden himself, whether it's Tony Blinken, whether it's a whole cast of characters in senior reaches of the Biden administration, some members of Congress, and then, of course, as we document in the indictment, leaders in such diverse fields as finance, as I mentioned, business more generally, media, Hollywood, and academia, even sports for that matter. How significant do you two gentlemen believe this, well, another audience member called it fifth column in our country, represents in terms of the dangers, whether it's from Cuba, whether it's from this no limits partnership more broadly?
About 13 years ago, I interviewed Russian historian Marina Kalashnikova, and she kind of shocked me because she was very interested in how the Russian military was developing. And she got into trouble. She is dead now, and she was poisoned with a lot of mercury. And the German doctors that examined her thought that there was radioactive elements in that mercury. But she told me, and the interview's available online still, that the reason that Russia and China were working together was that the leadership at the very top were both communist. And that was shocking. And this was that underneath that they had this common belief system, and that they worked with the communist parties abroad, and that the communist movement, we have to remember that the communist movement, the communists are a minority in this movement, that the fellow travelers are actually the majority, the people that are carried along with it, that are manipulated on the left, who believe all kinds of different things like radical environmentalism or feminism or wokeism. It has all been kind of managed, and that we don't really understand, but that this is a enormous fifth column in all the Western countries, and that is being used. And that more recently, the Russians have experimented with manipulating the right. And of course, it was Lyndon LaRouche, the Marxist-Leninist, who tried to found a right-wing Marxist party in 1971, the U.S. Labor Party, so that they would have useful idiots on the left and the right, and could perform various strategies with these parties. And so it's extremely significant when you have these people entering politics and these narratives that are originating in Russian or Chinese propaganda that are especially dividing Americans or divisive for Americans. And then you have the Chinese influence, buying businessmen, basically compromising American business, compromising American politicians, and influencing American policy so that we can't even disengage from them economically without massive economic damage. So that you've got major figures in economics saying, we can't disengage. So I think communism is underneath the surface. It's bizarre to say so, but communism didn't go away. And we are still dealing at some level, and the Chinese leaders themselves, you can find their statements referring to Mao and Lenin and going, what are they talking about this for? Well, they actually still believe it, and they're still using this kind of thought.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. Brad, your thoughts on the fellow traveler problem?
I would add to what Jeff has said, the tremendous vulnerabilities that we have in the homeland to saboteurs, for example, targeting our electrical grid. And our colleague at the Center for Security Policy, Tommy Waller, has done great work in identifying vulnerabilities. And even without saboteurs, of course, the grid is already under tremendous stress, as the residents of Texas have been finding out, and we all may find out this summer. Jeff usefully has said that this is a tool of communist ideology, and indeed it is. It's agitation and propaganda, which the Bolsheviks originated, formulated, and then was woven into the Communist International efforts to, sponsored by Moscow, to work through, as well as communist parties, but also work through front organizations and fellow travelers to influence, to wage political warfare around the world. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the Soviets attempted this in the Cold War against us, unsuccessfully, of course, and the Chinese are doing this now, which is simply what we should expect them to do through the United Front organization, as well as, if you will, an unofficial United Front. So the Chinese government explicitly, the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese government, of course, are attempting explicitly to work through individuals, also to work through front organizations to influence the politics and economic life of countries around the world, and to ensure that there is, from Beijing's perspective, a positive relationship, that finance continues to flow, investment continues to flow, economic exchange continues to flow. But if we were to move into crisis, or if we were to move into war, agents of influence, saboteurs, as well as spies, of course, which are sure to exist, of course, from Cuba, but also from China, would are a great danger, of course, a great threat, and would surface, of course, quite likely in abundance as we move towards a crisis situation, or if we move to a conflict. And so it's a very worrisome situation, but one that we should expect because, again, this is standard operating procedure for communist governments.
I just would add to your list there, Brad, some, as I understand it, 330,000 students that are Chinese nationals in this country, every single one of whom has been selected by the Chinese Communist Party, given their permission to come to the United States for a course of studies. And by the way, it's generally, as you know better than I, Brad, with your experience in academia, generally not the case. They're studying English literature. They're doing hard sciences, and many of those with direct relevance to military applications. And in fact, we've seen, and we'll be studying this more closely in coming webinars, a profound shift in terms of the advantages in terms of high technology, especially ones directly relevant, as I say, to military purposes, between the United States and China, thanks, I have the feeling, in no small measure, to the training of a generation or more of Chinese students at our best universities in hard sciences, and with a view to complementing the effort to acquire legally or illegally high technology from us. And I do want to commend, and it looks as though we will not have Steve with us today, but he's done an absolutely superb job of late, including yesterday, program I caught on his War Room Pandemic program. I think this was the Battleground program at 6 p.m. last night. A very, very powerful prosecution of the case against Sequoia, capital A company that has been led in part by a guy by the name of Neil Shen, who, as we have talked about in previous programs, has been instrumental in both making major venture capital plays and using his insights from doing so to help inform and advance Chinese efforts to acquire such technology. It's really seditious in the extreme, it seems to me. I wanted to just turn to a topic that several of our audience members have asked, and we may have to wrap with this. But to both of you, in addition to the problem of illegal Chinese immigration, bringing in apparently some significant number of what appear to be People's Liberation Army special operators or other units of the Chinese military from across our southern border, we are apparently seeing a considerable uptick in migration illegally across the northern border as well. Several of our participants have asked about more generally, what is the Trudeau government doing vis-a-vis communist China, and calling to mind some training exercises that that government had offered to do with the People's Liberation Army for winter operations, for example, that are quite dangerous. So in the context of a problem we can readily agree is very real and growing. On this island 90 miles from our shore, there's a country that shares one of the world's longest borders with us that seems not among the people of Canada, I don't think, but within its highest ranks of the Trudeau government to be very problematic indeed. Brad, let me start with you.
It is a cause of great concern, and the Trudeau government has been mixed. It has a mixed record in dealing with the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. There has been a close relationship between the Chinese, the usual tactics that we expect have been present in Canada as well. But to Canada's credit, they have participated in freedom of navigation operations and transiting the Taiwan Straits, and a robust presence in RIMPAC, the annual Rim of the Pacific exercises undertaken and led by the United States Navy. So the Trudeau government's instincts might be to participate in the engagement school. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, there have been some positive steps coming from Canada. However, the latest, the fact that the northern border is now seems to be not in volume, but in terms of effect as porous as the southern border, is a cause of great concern, and there's much that the Trudeau government should be doing to stop that as well. And the flow is not just from Canada into the United States. Fentanyl coming into the United States and other narcotics, other dangerous products make their way into Canada, not directly but indirectly, crossing, of course, from America into Canada as well. Mm-hmm. So the Trudeau government has an incentive to ensure that border is as tightly controlled as is warranted. Thank you, Frank. And
we have an incentive to do the same on our side. Let me finish this up with you, Jeff Nyquist. Your thoughts on Canada and any other concluding thoughts?
Yeah, you had in 1997, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Intelligence Service did a study. It was called the Sidewinder Report. It's classified. I've seen a copy of it. I possess a copy of it. Maybe I shouldn't, but it's classified in Canada. And it was all about how the Chinese People's Liberation Army intelligence and Chinese intelligence had created agreements with Chinese triads, Chinese criminal groups, to infiltrate Canada and to use Canada as a highway to attack America in its flank across that northern border. And they were going to use the Chinese diaspora into Canada. They were going to change the laws in Canada so that the Chinese could get more of a hold. They were going to launder money through real estate to buy politicians and so on. And the recommendations of the Canadian Intelligence Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was that something had to be done. They had to act against this immediately in 1997. And what the Canadian government then did is they buried the reports. They would not act on it. And some of the officials in Canada who actually spoke out at the time and talked about the report said, this is an indication that the Chinese subversion of Canada has already proceeded to the point where we cannot stop it. And so now you see the Trudeau government. I think that the degree of corruption, and I think from Mexico with the cartels and the Russian mafia and the Chinese triads, again, moving drugs across the border, laundering drug money. These are avenues of corruption for local officials, for intelligence, for police, for the government. And I think we're getting it from both ends. And Canada is certainly one of those ends.
Jeff Nyquist, Dr. Bradley Thayer, let me just thank both of you for being with us in person. Our thanks as well to Ilarianov, as well as to Steve Bannon, who I know wanted to be with us and was unable to make this particular video, but I hope we will catch him in a future one. This is a critical moment, obviously, for our country. The evolutions of this no limits partnership between two very dangerous adversaries makes the threats we face vastly greater than would either of them on their own, especially the Chinese Communist Party. I hope we've helped illuminate what is at stake in connection with Xi Jinping's Cuba Gambit, and also what is to be anticipated may flow from the instability inside Russia, if indeed that's what we've witnessed, and what in any event may be forthcoming. We appreciate the attention that so many of you are paying to this series of videos. I hope you found this one to be informative as well as the others. And as with the others, I very much urge you to make them available to others in your circles of influence. If we are to save our country, we need, first and foremost, I believe, God's help. And I encourage everyone listening to this show to invoke it urgently. In addition, we need the American people to be cognizant of the challenges that we're facing, aware of the serious deficiencies in our own government and its conduct of these very, very fraught developments and those that may be yet forthcoming. And also to assure that they are equipped with good ideas about what we can do. And I commend shamelessly our new book, The Indictment, with its 20 action items. A variation on the theme is what is now on offer from the committee, and we will have shortly available a listing of the 20 that we think are particularly relevant to the present danger of China and Cuba. With that, I'm going to say thank you all for listening and for joining us, many of you week upon week, and turn it back over to our extraordinarily capable and deeply valued colleague, Didi Laugesen, the Executive Secretary of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, with also my thanks to Oleg Atbashian, our terrific webmaster and the man who makes most of these videos and other things possible. With that, Didi, back to you.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks to all of our panelists. Most especially, thank you to our audience for being here week to week. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world and how the USA is betrayed by CCP captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.